Thank you, Professor Farrell, and welcome to everybody. I want to start my remarks by stating plainly that Gaglianese is not and will never be the focus of our work. Rather, his reaction to our previous teaching is a product of our work. What do I mean? It is imperative to remember that what triggered, and pun intended, what triggered his vitriol was an educational event. It inflamed for him the insecurities and fears that Professor Farrell just outlined. The undermining of the privilege he did nothing to earn or deserve, save for the happenstance of being recognized as white in American society. For this privilege to remain intact, people like Frank rely on what we are referring to as the miseducation of difference during this teaching. To provide a different analysis of human difference and to celebrate rather than weaponize diversity represents for Frank what he called poking the bear. Today, we are here to tell Frank and others who think like him that we are here to reclaim the forest for everyone, and they better get used to it. We will not be cowed, we will not be intimidated, and we are going nowhere. So how do we achieve this reclamation? By destroying the very foundation of this miseducation, the manner in which racial difference is interpreted. White supremacist ideology results from a genealogy of thought, a genealogy that can be traced back to the justification for the transatlantic slave trade first, and then compounded by colonialism and the settler colony. As many of you already know, the material wealth of the West is a direct product, first of the enslavement of Africans, and then the colonization of non-Western spaces. The accumulation of this wealth has manifested itself in three forms of violence: economic, political, and epistemological. The economic violence that I refer to is not only the plundering of the natural resources from other places, but also the systematic dispossession of land from indigenous peoples all around the world, but specifically in the settler colony. America, of course, is a settler colony. In order to ensure settler domination in the colony, it was imperative to exclude all not recognized as white from the political process. This then accounts for what I refer to as political violence, the magic trick of settler colonialism. Native Americans effectively were made foreigners on their own land, while the settler now claimed to be native, as they alone were regarded as properly belonging, as true citizens, and as worthy of having the vote. But the most important form of violence I will be discussing is precisely what informs the miseducation people like Gaglianese rely upon to protect their privilege. This is epistemological violence, or the violence embedded in the manner in which knowledge has been created. What is important to note is that overcoming this form of violence presents the greatest challenge for anyone interested in creating a more equitable world: the problem of thought. The enslavement of Africans was not happenstance. It was a product of thought. And we associate thought with rationality and logic. So what was the logic here? The logic was, how can we best enrich ourselves? This is the same logic used to justify colonialism. However, to flat out admit that the enslavement and domination of non-European peoples was simply about material enrichment did not fit how those who participated and benefited from slavery and colonialism imagined themselves. As can be gleaned from the justification used for colonialism, the so-called civilizing mission, or the white man's burden, the West imagined itself to be more civilized and therefore supposedly superior to everyone else. As such, a discourse needed to be created that justified the domination and dehumanization of everyone else. The initial justification for enslaving Africans was ostensibly to ensure their conversion to Christianity, a justification endorsed by Pope Nicholas V in the mid-1400s. This differentiation, Christian from African, was how identity was formed on the slave plantations of the Caribbean. It was here that whiteness as we now understand it was invented. By the 1690s, extensive slave plantations dominated the Caribbean island of Barbados, which was controlled by the British. What is of particular importance for us to note is that by 1697, the distinction between those of African and those of European descent was not made along distinctly racial but rather religious lines. British settlers and plantation owners were referred to as Christian, and the enslaved Africans were referred to as Negroes. As you may imagine, only adult men recognized as Christian were allowed to participate in the political process. However, by 1697, there were increasingly more free black men who started agitating for the right to vote. In accordance with the law of the time, voting rights were reserved for property-owning Christian men who were at least 21 years of age. So what do you imagine free black men did? They got baptized and now they could claim to be Christian as well. This form of equality was unthinkable to British colonialists. So what did they do? Easy. They changed the rules of the game. As enslaved and formerly enslaved people converted, the colonists changed the language in their law books to replace the word Christian with the word white. In this moment, whiteness as we understand it was invented. It was intentional and it was strategic. It declared that, quote, every white man professing the Christian religion, the free and natural born subject of the King of England or naturalized, who hath attained to the full age of 21 years and hath 10 acres of freehold, shall be deemed a freeholder. Only those regarded as freeholders were allowed to vote. It was the first time that whiteness was used to determine voting eligibility. What we therefore see is that whiteness was invented to ensure the exclusion of free black men from the political process. This had nothing to do with racial difference and everything to do with maintaining power. I'm going to repeat that. This had nothing to do with racial difference and everything to do with maintaining power. At this point, we should take stock. This ploy by the Christians, or whites as they were now known, was an exercise first and foremost of thought. So what was the logic here? Basically to ensure that political power continued to reside solely with those men regarded as of European descent. How does one achieve this? You make rules that ensure that this is the case. To this end, notions of racial difference replaced religion as a means to discern who was regarded as worthy of participating in the political process. But more importantly for our discussion, race was understood as biological. We have been taught to think about race as biological. After all, race supposedly makes reference to your degree of pigmentation, which is determined by genetics. In this way, it is sustainable to argue that race is a biological category. However, what is of crucial importance for us to acknowledge is the manner in which this genetic difference is analyzed. To illustrate, this new law in Barbados also included the so-called one-drop rule. It stated that even having one drop of Negro blood was enough to disqualify anyone from having the vote. This law essentially rendered blackness as a contaminant. I'm going to repeat that. This law essentially rendered blackness as a contaminant. Even a single drop of so-called Negro blood was sufficient to render someone as unfit to vote. The implication of this law was that those not regarded as white were biologically ineligible to be part of the political process. So how was this difference interpreted? On the basis of the melanin content of any given individual, an assessment could be made about their suitability to achieve full citizenry. In this way, racial hierarchy was created in the way that we understand it now. Those regarded as white were regarded as supposedly superior based on perceptions of the biological, now understood in racial terms. At this point, it's important to turn to the body and understand it as an archive. Our bodies are repositories of knowledge. In the first instance, our bodies are written upon by our experiences, both good and bad. Simultaneously and outside our control, our bodies are also written upon by discourse. When we consider the one-drop rule essentially rendered black folks as contaminant, as communities that could infect society, we are able to discern how this discourse wrote on those bodies. As the British also colonized what is now known as the USA, and were responsible for the first enslaved Africans reaching American shores 401 years ago, this understanding of race was transplanted from the Caribbean to the United States. This accounts for the continued unbelonging of African Americans in the land of their birth. Anyone who doubts me need only revisit the very constitution of this country, which categorically denied the humanity of blackness. In fact, so convinced were the founding fathers of the supposed inferiority of black folk that they converted this supposed subservience to an apparent mathematical accuracy, as is evidenced in the 3/5 Compromise. This very same humanity was denied during enslavement. This very same humanity was denied during Jim Crow. This very same humanity was denied when people were lynched. Now we see this very same humanity repeatedly and brutally denied by US law enforcement officials. It is therefore this very discourse that colors how those identified as black experience the world. And it is this understanding of blackness that is the foundation of the miseducation Frank depends upon to have his white skin ensure his continued privilege. People like Frank rely on the institutions of state, notably law enforcement, to make physical the discourse of supposed contaminant. We must remember that the genesis of the modern police was the slave patrol. These patrols had three functions that remain embedded in present-day law enforcement and American society more broadly. The first function was to chase down, apprehend, and to return to their owners what was then termed as runaway slaves. This speaks to ideas of belonging. And where did blackness belong in America? As enslaved, as captured, as incarcerated. We see this manifest itself in our present in the prison industrial complex, where demographically disproportionate number of African Americans are incarcerated. If we consider the hypersurveillance, intimidation, and excessive disciplining African American communities are subjected to, and the way that black men especially are seemingly hunted by the police, have ideas of black belonging in America then really changed? The second function of slave patrols was to provide a form of organized terror to deter slave revolts. So how do we see this then manifest itself in our present? Think about how law enforcement has responded all over the country to Black Lives Matter protests. Think about, think about what is happening in Rochester as we speak. People are demanding that the police do what it is supposed to protect and serve everyone in the same way. Yet this is basically being treated as a revolt. Demanding rights that are constitutionally guaranteed is regarded as justifying the use of tear gas, rubber bullets, police dogs, pepper spray, and routinely results in severe beatings or worse. These attacks on civilians reflects precisely the kind of organized terror that slave patrols routinely subjected enslaved people to. The third function of these slave patrols was to maintain a form of discipline of the enslaved who were subject to summary justice outside of the law if they violated any plantation rules. This kind of vigilantism is a hallmark in terms of how minority communities experience law enforcement in the United States. What happened to George Floyd was an execution. It was summary justice. You cannot kneel on someone's neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds and claim anything else. The haphazard way in which police fired into Breonna Taylor's apartment bears even more testimony in this regard. How is this not a form of summary justice? This plantation-like understanding of blackness as in need of constant surveillance, discipline, intimidation, and unthinkable violence persists today precisely of how blackness is understood in the country. This miseducation of difference has rendered especially African American men as supposedly innately criminal. This understanding of blackness, therefore, draws on the biological. It would seem that the presence of certain levels of melanin is interpreted as being indicative of criminality. If this is so, show me the scientific research. I will wait. However, simultaneously, our bodies also produce knowledge. This means that we are able to reject this miseducation of difference and embrace and celebrate human diversity. This means that we are able to speak back to any analysis of difference that creates hierarchy. This is not confined to race, but includes gender, religion, sexual orientation, ableism, mental health, and misogyny. To not speak back is to embrace the miseducation that Frank and his cronies rely upon. To not speak back is to make ourselves complicit in the violences that order our society. To not speak back is to disavow the inequities and inequalities of American society. To not speak back is to view yourself through the eyes of someone like Frank. I want to leave you with this quote from James Baldwin. Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. We need to face the miseducation of difference in our everyday lives, because until we face it, we cannot change it. Do not avert your gaze. If you look away, people like Frank win. Do not avert your gaze. If you look away, you condemn those you love to live in a world beset with hatred and division. Do not avert your gaze. If you look away, you lose yourself. Amandla, power. Aware to the people. Thank you. I'm going to pass on the floor now to Professor Kelly Johnson. Kelly, the floor is yours.